Introduce myself and the purpose of this webinar. As I said, my name is Tim. I'm here at New America, a research fellow focusing on cybersecurity and human rights online. And I serve as the co-chair of the Civil Society Participation Advisory Board for the Global Conference on Cyberspace that will take place in The Hague in the Netherlands in April of this year. I'm also a member of the Freedom Online Coalition's working group on cybersecurity. And it's a great pleasure to be here with you today and to spend the next 60 minutes on this introductory session of the webinar series focused on cybersecurity and internet freedom. Before I start, let me give you a brief overview of the webinar series, and you will be able to find more information about the series in the chat that Aditi pasted earlier today. So for those of you who are just joining us now, feel free to review this text and the introductory text later on after this webinar. Over the next 6 weeks, we will have a series of different webinars focusing on specific topics relating to cybersecurity. And this session today is the first session and the introductory session as part of the series. The next 6 weeks, the sessions will cover first a tech session, so to make you more familiar with the technology behind this policy debate. The third session will focus on roles and responsibilities of different actors, including government, civil society, and the private sector. And the third session will be followed by 2 sessions focused on cybersecurity from the perspective of international peace and security, followed by a session on cybercrime. And the last 2 sessions of the series, the 5th and the 6th, will focus on capacity building and privacy. You will find a detailed agenda of all the webinars and their dates on the website, and you will also find recordings of each of the webinars on the website after they've been conducted. So as you submit your questions throughout the webinar, please be aware that we are recording this session and we are also recording the Q&A, just so you're aware of that. Some of you might wonder why we structured the webinar as they are and why we've chosen those topics. This relates to the fact that this webinar is supposed to be part of the preparation for the Global Conference on Cyberspace. So we designed this webinar series to mirror the agenda of the conference itself and the topics, the main topics that will be discussed at the conference. As such, we are trying to be as comprehensive as we can, but obviously there are parts of this debate that we will not be able to cover, but we hope to be able to answer as many questions of yours as you might have as part of Q&A that are built into each webinar. Each of the webinars will consist of 20 to 40 minutes of a presentation, followed by a Q&A. So if you have questions throughout the webinar or afterward, please type your question in either the chat window or the Q&A window that is part of this platform. And my colleague Aditi will be collecting your questions, and I will be answering them after the presentation. Please type your questions and do not try to use the audio function, which, given that we have several dozen participants, would make this a lot harder for us to manage. So please type your questions. With that, let's now get started and talk about cybersecurity, particularly cybersecurity and the cybersecurity debate from a human rights perspective, and why this is an important topic for civil society organizations around the world to follow and to become involved in. I'd like to start first by spending a couple of minutes to discuss what is cybersecurity and how do we define it. That is not an obvious, that is obviously not just an easy way to start, but it's also a very good way to show why this topic is important for human rights organizations around the world and why there is a clear human rights dimension to this policy debate. As a matter of fact, last year, I led a research project here at New America that focused on cyber definitions, and we spent several weeks just collecting existing definitions of cybersecurity. And what we found was that there are several hundred definitions that exist relating to cybersecurity and information security at this point. If you're interested in this, please feel free to search later online the Global Cyber Definitions Database, where you'll find more information. More importantly for this webinar today is, though, that these definitions are very diverse, very broad, that there is a lack of understanding and a lot of times a lack of a common approach to how to define this policy issue. Some definitions are more technical in nature, others are more policy focused. Some tend to be very narrow, others tend to be very broad. One of the most common questions that emerges when we discuss cybersecurity definitions is, why do you call it cybersecurity and not information security? Information security is the term that was used back in the 80s and 90s, continues to be used by a lot of IT professionals who've been doing this for a very, very long time, and who are asking, so why are we calling this cybersecurity all of a sudden? And I think that's a very legitimate question. The important piece about this is that there's actually a very good argument why in the international setting there's an important nuance between the cybersecurity and the information security definition and terminology. In many ways, the term information security that is used by a lot of technologists has taken on a life of its own in the international policy debate and among many diplomats. Some governments have defined information security quite broadly, and in a sense that includes threats that could pose information that could pose as a threat to the social stability of the state. The reason why this is a concern to many cybersecurity experts and many human rights groups is because this broad definition would allow the cybersecurity policy debate and this definition of information security to be used to justify censorship and surveillance. And it's for that reason that many governments have actually taken the very conscious choice of using the term cybersecurity instead of information security, to make clear that the way that they are using the term cybersecurity in international fora does not include the definition of information that could pose a threat to the social stability of the state in the form of content. So essentially, in short, the bottom line is some definitions of information security are so broad that they include content, and that the definition of information security could be used to justify actions that we would consider to be a violation of human rights. And it's for that reason that there's this important nuance at the international level of why a lot of people are using the term cybersecurity and information security. This is a fact that is not known to a lot of people that engage in cybersecurity policy primarily domestically, because they haven't interacted at the international level. That is a topic that's for example, very pronounced here in the US when you go to the West Coast, where a lot of people tend to use the term information security, whereas on the East Coast and in Washington, a lot of people use the term cybersecurity. But for the purposes of this webinar and the global conference, it's important to be aware of this nuance in the international context, and why there's actually a human rights dimension that favors the use of the term cybersecurity, and explains a little bit more about this debate. For your information, after this webinar, we will not only post the recording of this webinar on the website, but we will also point you to 3 to 4 articles that will provide you with more information for you to read after this webinar if you're interested in a particular topic that I will discuss briefly during this presentation. For the purposes of this webinar and for the series at large, we would like to propose actually to use the definition that the Freedom Online Coalition's Working Group on Cybersecurity has developed in the fall. And what this group came up with is a two-pronged approach. First, in the preambular part, the group is saying that international human rights law and international humanitarian law apply online as well as offline, and cybersecurity must protect technological innovation and the exercise of human rights. Regarding the actual definition of cybersecurity, the working group suggests to use the following definition. Cybersecurity is the preservation, through policy, technology, and education, of the availability, confidentiality, and integrity of information and its underlying infrastructure, so as to preserve the security of persons, both online and offline. This definition was developed based on the standard of the International Standards Organization, the 27000 standard, and tries to merge both the technical approach to this definition, that is the ISO standard, with a specific focus on persons, and that ultimately the goal and the end of cybersecurity is to make people more secure, both online as well as offline. With that, let me now move beyond this first part of this webinar and the discussion about definitions, and let's dive a little deeper into what is cybersecurity and how can we think about it, and how can we approach it from a human rights perspective. So after this short introduction about definitions, I'd like to suggest an easy technical framework to think about an intrusion. So essentially, that is a sub-part of the cybersecurity debate, but a very important one, and I think it's useful to share this with you. This concept was developed by Herb Lin, who's now a researcher at Stanford University, and Herb Lin suggests that we think about an intrusion into a computer system in three components. You essentially, the person who intrudes the system, the hacker, essentially needs three things. The hacker needs access, a vulnerability, and a payload. Access means that the person needs to either have physical access by being an insider at the organization, or remote access to the system, which could be through a vulnerability, a backdoor, or simply a software flaw that exists in the system. And through this access and the vulnerability, the hacker actually gets access to the system. Once the hacker is inside the system, what he or she ends up doing in the system depends on the payload, the piece of the code, the malware, that determines whether the hacker might just copy data, manipulate data, or delete data, which will determine the effect of the intrusion down the road. This is an easy way to think about intrusion from a technical perspective that is useful to think about the policy dimensions of this down the road and the different actors involved. Just to recap, thinking about an intrusion in three components: access, vulnerability, and payload, and the payload determining what actually happens once the intruder is in the system and the effect that results from that. So after this background session, this background part on definitions and a technical approach to thinking about this, let me now spend a few minutes to talk about the actors and the different policy debates involved. If you are a hacker who intrudes a system, then it depends, your motivation will determine how this is being conceived. So if there's an economic motivation behind it, it's an act of crime. If there's a political or military objective behind your actions, it could be considered possibly an act of war, or an act of sabotage, or an act of espionage. This is also replicated in the international fora, where you essentially have two main strands, or three main strands actually, relating to cybersecurity. The first one is a very active strand on cybersecurity, both in terms of the national policy debates, as well as at the international level, which includes the discussions about law enforcement cooperation and the Convention on Cybercrime, and other regional conventions that are already in place, for example, the one that the African Union recently adopted. And then you have the second policy debate that focuses on cybersecurity from the international peace and security perspective. That is more the political, military stream of the debate and involves a different set of actors, both in terms of those who are pursuing malicious activity with a political military objective, as well as the people involved in trying to develop policies addressing those. And then the third dimension, the third policy process that I would count and include in this is the privacy and surveillance stream that has risen on the agenda and has attracted a lot more attention in the last 2 years. So if we think about these three streams, it's also clear that cybersecurity is important from a human rights perspective, not just from a freedom of expression point of view. it actually touches on a range of other human rights as well, and not just human rights law, but also humanitarian law. And this is something that I hope many of you will also take away from this webinar, that the cybersecurity discussion also includes discussions about how international humanitarian law applies. So this is essentially the law that the International Committee of the Red Cross has been the guardian of for the last 150 years, and where you have the principles and rules governing how people can be protected and what rights they enjoy at times of an armed conflict. The question here is very similar to the debate that we saw in the UN Human Rights Council play out in 2011, is whether existing international law applies online as well as offline. So in the UN Human Rights Council obviously adopted the landmark resolution that said that human rights apply online as well as offline. And you had a parallel process and a parallel debate take place with regard to cybersecurity from the perspective of international peace and security, where in the UN, particularly in the first committee, there's been a group of governmental experts, the UN Group of Governmental Experts, or the acronym is UNGGE, that has been focusing on this particular aspect, and in a report in 2013 highlighted that existing international law applies to cyberspace as well. So this is to show that in addition to the human rights debate that I believe many of you are familiar with as part of the UN Human Rights Council, there's a parallel debate that has been taking place that has focused more on the humanitarian piece. And I would make the argument that from a human rights group's perspective, it's important to follow both discussions very carefully, because it's as important to ensure that the existing provisions governing how we protect people and people's lives during an armed conflict is also important and should not be neglected. And that has actually been an area where we've seen a lot less civil society engagement in recent years. The important piece here and the opportunity for civil society is that this report by the UNGGE in 2013 actually makes explicit reference in trying to include more civil society engagement and participation, and to pursue the multi-stakeholder approach as part of these discussions as well. For those of you who are interested more in this relationship between human rights law and international humanitarian law, there's a great blog post by the International Committee of the Red Cross that we will also post online for those of you who are interested to learn a little bit more about this. Apart from this distinction between the protections and rights at times of war and times of peace in terms of human rights law and international humanitarian law, the gray area, the other big debate where a lot of this comes together, is what many people in the cybersecurity debate call the debate about sub-threshold activity. So this is a term that I wanted to include in this webinar because that might come up at the global conference, and it's one of the, it is a focus of the discussions this year and will likely to continue to be the focus of this conversation in the next 2 to 3 years. What does this term sub-threshold activity refer to? So the threshold it refers to is the threshold of an armed attack or use of force that would trigger the application of international humanitarian law, for which we have a rich body of law through the Red Cross that has been implemented by countries around the world. Below this threshold is now a range of activity that any actors, that could be individuals, it could be criminal groups or governments, can carry out that will have an effect and could cause damage that governments would not consider to meet the threshold of an armed attack or use of force. The question becomes, though, what norms and what principles should apply to this activity, and some of this activity has not been possible before and has been enabled by the internet, and there is no agreement internationally of what principles and rules should apply to this. And that has been a main focus of the debate in the past, and that's, I believe, where there will be a lot of convergence and a lot of overlap between existing discussions in the human rights community, with that in the international peace and security community, with that in the law enforcement and cybercrime community, and possibly other areas of law for that matter, be it environmental law or public health law, because that's an area where a lot of people are currently trying to figure out what kind of principles and rules do we need to either mirror, replicate, or develop for this specific type of activity that we currently have no agreement on how to use it. So after talking about definitions, the technical approach to thinking about intrusions, the strands of the debate from the cybercrime, international peace and security, surveillance and privacy perspective, and this important discussion about this sub-threshold activity, I'd now like to point out a few other related discussions that are part of the cybersecurity policy debate and that you will likely encounter when you're at the Global Conference in Cyberspace. And this is the cyber capacity building efforts, and then the fact that governments around the world at present are still figuring out for themselves of how to set up structures as part of their national systems, and are making this up along the way as we go. So we are very much at a stage where today we only have about a little over 2 billion people that have access to the internet, with 2/3 of the world's population yet to gain access, plus the devices that will connect to the system through the Internet of Things. And as all of this is happening with the technology, we have this process going on where governments are trying to adapt their own structures, and in the meantime, those countries that have not set up structures yet that they are refining, other governments are encouraging them to set up structures. So there is a big debate taking place as well of what models are we using for countries around the world that are looking into what structures to set up right now. And I think that's another important component for civil society to follow and become engaged in, because ultimately the models that other countries are encouraged to look into and to possibly follow, those will be the standards that will diffuse around the world and will essentially set up the governance system for cybersecurity moving forward. This is my brief overview of an introduction in terms of cybersecurity and human rights. There are many different topics that we can discuss during the remaining 30 minutes, be it different actors involved, be it different processes at the UN or ITU, be it different concepts to think about this. So I look forward to your question and encourage you all to type your questions in the chat or Q&A window, and Aditi will send me those questions, and I will answer those in the next 30 minutes. Okay, so it looks like we don't have questions yet. So let me walk through the seminar series and the different seminars that will follow this introductory session. And in the meantime, feel free to ask questions in the meantime, and Aditi will send those to me. So let me briefly run through the seminar and give you a little bit more details about what the different sessions will focus on. So on March 12th, the second session will take place, and we'll focus on more of the technology piece and the technology foundation behind this policy debate. And this will focus on providing more of an overview of what cybersecurity means from a technical perspective in terms of not just the software piece, but also the hardware piece and critical infrastructure protection, and the importance of, for example, industrial control systems and SCADA systems. If this is the first time you've heard about SCADA systems and industrial control systems, I encourage you to join this webinar on March 12th. It will provide a more comprehensive overview of some of the topics that I alluded to in the webinar earlier today. The third session on roles and responsibilities will take place on March 16th, and this will focus on the fundamental question of how we set up for dealing with cybersecurity, and what are the roles and responsibilities of governments, the private sector, and civil society. That is not we obviously have the conversation in the internet governance debate, but drills down a little bit deeper what this means from a cybersecurity perspective and what the human rights dimension is relating to this. The fourth session will then focus on cybersecurity from the international peace and security perspective, and will give you an overview and a mapping of the different processes at the UN in the different committees, primarily the first committee on international peace and security and the third committee, as well as the efforts in various regional organizations, for example, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the ASEAN Regional Forum, and several other ongoing initiatives at this moment. And we'll also discuss the role of civil society in these fora at this point. The fifth session on March 27th will focus on cybercrime, so cybersecurity from the perspective of actors with economic incentives. And we'll focus on this to provide more details of the processes at this point, the different instruments that already exist, the Convention on Cybercrime, the AU Convention, and will be a deep dive specifically focused on cybercrime. The sixth session will be on April 1st, and will focus on the capacity building debate, which is actually an issue that is cross-cutting and is part of the discussions in various, both in the cybersecurity from an international peace and security perspective, the cybercrime discussions, and will be an overview of the issues relating to capacity building. And then the last session on April 7th will be focused on privacy. So we have a few questions now, so let me take those first. The first question is, what would humanitarian online mean? That's a great question, and so let me first break this down into two components. One, if we take the term humanitarian as a general term, it would obviously be very broad in that being a humanitarian line can have different meanings, be it working toward the greater good of humanity, working toward the greater good of the internet as a system. In the context that I was using it, I was referring to the international humanitarian law and the body of law that exists primarily for armed conflict, which has a connection to international human rights law and is complementary, but is also a separate body of law where, if we look at cybersecurity and the debate that has been taking place comprehensively, it's important to be aware of that debate that has been taking place as well. We will post a link to the ICRC blog post on this after this webinar, so I think a more comprehensive answer to this question will be provided by the blog post, and I will make sure to point you to that later on. The next question is, does this conference try to help shaping the policy model for cybersecurity? So I'm not the Dutch government that is hosting the conference, so this is a question that will be answered by the Dutch government and that you will find more information on at the website already. My understanding of the conference is that the conference is trying to produce concrete results that will help to move the cybersecurity debate forward. And the Dutch government has been very active and very interested to increase civil society participation in the conference and to provide input into the conference itself. So this webinar series was deliberately designed by the conference organizers to be a preparation for the conference, to provide a more comprehensive overview of the different pieces that relate to the cybersecurity debate, and to give civil society already an understanding of what topics will be discussed at the conference in The Hague in April. So that is a very explicit goal of the conference organizers focused on cybersecurity. And in terms of what the conference is trying to achieve, I encourage you all to check out the official conference website, where you will find more information about the agenda and more information about what the topics will be to be discussed. The next question is, how can cybersecurity concerns by governments lead to censorship? So this is a follow-up question to my remarks at the beginning about definitions. And this question, how cybersecurity can lead to censorship, is at the core of why the cybersecurity debate also has a human rights component. If we define cybersecurity or information security very broadly and define it such that it includes a definition of information that would be a threat to the social stability of the state, as some countries have defined it, then their human rights experts have been concerned that this language could be used to include content as a potential cybersecurity threat, and therefore would give governments the legitimacy to actually try to control content. It's for that reason that the human rights experts who have been involved in this debate have been very cautious and very focused in trying to use a cybersecurity definition or an information security definition that's more narrow, that focuses on the network, and that makes clear that the cybersecurity debate is not about content, and that content in and of itself is not a cybersecurity threat, but that this falls under the policy discussion about freedom of expression, and that the UN Human Rights Council already has adopted a resolution that affirms that human rights apply online as well as offline. So there is a risk that censorship becomes justified under cybersecurity policy because cybersecurity is defined in a way that's too broad and would allow certain governments to justify censorship on cybersecurity grounds. The next question, and again on this topic, we will be posting a short article that will outline this discussion about the definitions and the implications with more sources more fully. So I hope to have answered this question at this point, and more information will be available online at the website, later on. The next question is, what role does the private sector have in protecting human rights online? That's obviously, this is worthy of its own webinar session, and that's why we do have follow-up webinars that focus on this explicitly, both in terms of the roles and responsibilities of different actors, and then when we talk about other components, we have the privacy debate later on, where we obviously what relates to this is the role of the private sector in both in terms of internet service providers, in terms of generally intermediaries and intermediary liability. So this is a big governance question that you will learn more about later on as part of this webinar series. So please make sure to check the webinar agenda for that specific session if you're particularly interested in that. The next question is, what role can civil society play in shaping cybersecurity policies and law? That's a great question, and obviously one that is also directly relevant for the conference. So let me start first by speaking about the conference and then talk about the various cybersecurity processes generally and opportunities for civil society to become engaged and to participate. With regard to the conference, there will is a number of seats have been reserved for civil society representatives to join the conference. And I'm sure that many of you have already signed up and are planning to come to The Hague in April. And at the conference itself, civil society representatives will be part of the various panel discussions and will participate in those. And you will have an opportunity to participate in the conference agenda specifically with more details about what that will look like in the specific process that will be shared with you later on. I don't know the specifics of this at this point, but I'm sure that more details will become available on that soon. With regard to the existing processes in various global and regional organizations, how civil society can become involved obviously depends on the organization and the institution. Let me start with the United Nations. At the, if we're talking about the UN headquarters, you have an existing system of observer status organizations, so NGOs that have been granted the status of an observer organization and can therefore participate in the various meetings that are taking place both in Geneva and New York. If your organization is already part of that, that would be one avenue to talk to your colleagues who are covering this issue in Geneva and New York. If you do not have that status yet, you might want to look into becoming accredited. Apart from the observer status, generally, the UN has different mechanisms for including and inviting civil society participation. One that I would like to point out specifically is the mechanism that has been set up by the Security Council in the 1990s, and it's called the ARIA formula. And this ARIA formula was designed to enable the Security Council and its members to invite external experts to brief members of the Security Council on a specific topic. This mechanism has been used a lot in, to get representatives from NGOs around the world to New York or Geneva from conflict zones or on specific topics to brief the Security Council and to provide a first-hand account of the importance of this topic from a human rights perspective. I think that's an interesting aspect that could be emulated for the cybersecurity discussions as well. But this is really a topic where there's an opportunity for civil society to be creative of how existing mechanisms can be used and to fully exploit the other mechanisms that exist in other organizations. The ITU has obviously been working on this during the past several years as part of the Internet governance debate. The UN Human Rights Council obviously has a clear system for civil society participation. So the detailed answer to that question depends on what specific organization are you interested in participating and shaping, and what your focus is. Are you more interested in focusing on the cybersecurity policies and laws, focusing on cybercrime, or those focusing more on the political and military type of activity as part of the international peace and security discussions? So that answer really depends on what your specific focus is and organization. One of the other articles that we will post online is a great paper that was written and published by a Swiss NGO called ICT for Peace. And they published a paper last year that's focused specifically on cybersecurity and the multi-stakeholder approach and what avenues civil society has for becoming involved. So the person who asked the specific question, please check out the website afterward for that specific report. The next question is, please explain the rationale behind the UN conclusion on the application of human rights online. So, I think one way to think about how we can structure the discussions that have been taking place in the different fora is to break it down into three components. So when the UN Human Rights Council adopted its resolution in 2011, affirming that human rights apply online as well as offline, that was essentially a process that I would call norms translation. What I mean by that is we have an existing set of norms and laws, international human rights law, that we developed over the decades, and now we have this new technology that exists where we didn't have an agreement what norms should apply to this new technology. So what happened in 2011 was that the UN Human Rights Council affirmed that this existing body of law now also applies to this new technology. So you have this translation exercise from the existing body of law to this new technology, and the UN Human Rights Council affirming that it applies. The rationale behind that is because the translation was necessary because there was a question whether this existing body of norms does apply or not. And certain actors were pushing back against that and were contesting this notion that we should use this existing body of norms and law and apply it to this new technology. And so you have as a second component this norm contestation of whether existing laws and norms apply to cyberspace or not, which is also this debate about whether international humanitarian law applies or not, is a norm contestation, a contestation of this existing body of law, international humanitarian law, and the attempt in trying to translate this existing international humanitarian law body of law to this new technology, which we now have an agreement through the 2013 report. The third component of how we can think about this process is norm development, that apart from the contesting of existing norms and the translation of existing norms to this new technology, there will be certain areas and certain types of activities that this new technology enables that wasn't possible before, and that we don't have an agreement on yet of what kind of norms should apply, and we might need to develop new norms for this new type of activity. So in addition to norm contestation and norm translation, I would add norm development as a third aspect that is underlying a lot of these discussions across fora and across issue areas, be it cybercrime or cybersecurity. And I hope that answered that question. The next question is, do you think an international cybersecurity law or treaty could truly protect human rights? That's a great question. Let me preface this by saying that I'm not a lawyer, so I'm a political scientist by training. On the discussion about an international cybersecurity treaty, let me briefly talk a little bit about that, because I think it's very important. So first, it depends what type of cybersecurity are we talking about, and I think that should always be the first question as you think about the cybersecurity policy discussions of cybersecurity has become a very broad term, but it means very different things. It could mean we are talking about cybersecurity from a cybercrime perspective. It could mean cybersecurity from the peace and security and warfare perspective. It could mean cybersecurity as part of the surveillance debate that a lot of people also call a cybersecurity debate. So first, we do have a set of treaties that already govern certain parts of cybersecurity, and I reference specifically the Cybercrime Convention that already exists. And you have several dozen countries that have already signed up for that. You have the African Union instrument. So there is already, there are existing legal instruments specifically focused on cybersecurity. With regard to the discussion about a cybersecurity treaty that goes beyond the cybercrime context, and that has been part of the discussion as part of the process on focus on international peace and security, I would I would like to point to 2 points. One, at this point in time, my personal view is it's premature to talk about the cybersecurity treaty because of the huge differences that exist with regard to definitions. As a hypothetical, if states around the world would start negotiating a cybersecurity treaty today, I think there is a concern and a risk that because the definitions are so broad, the treaty might include a definition of cybersecurity that would be of concern to many human rights groups around the world, because it would be so broad that it could be construed to justify censorship and surveillance. So until there is a better agreement and understanding how to define cybersecurity and how to narrow the scope to make clear that content is part of a different discussion, I think it will be very hard to come to an agreement, and I think that's a concern that particular human rights groups should keep an eye out and follow. Related to that is, apart from the definitions, we are still in this process of trying to figure out how we can translate the existing bodies of law that we have to this new technology. And we've made some great progress in the last 3 to 5 years on this topic, both in terms of the UN Human Rights Council and the GGE. I don't think it's fully complete yet. So I think it's important to, for now, focus on this translation exercise, and in parallel trying to think about what other norms do we need to develop that currently aren't covered, and to identify those, and then to think about how do we get to a place where we have a set of norms that will govern the specific type of activity. And here the political scientist in me is speaking in pointing out that norms from a political science perspective are much broader than law. Norms can include law, but norms can also take a lot of other forms, which can be informal agreements, it can be political statements, it can be political statements that can be used for naming and shaming, and civil society groups holding governments accountable based on these statements. So I think this debate is much broader than just the discussion about what legal instruments we use and whether there needs to be a new treaty. So those are my thoughts on this, but I'm sure this will be a topic for further discussion as part of this webinar series. Okay, so we have 5-6 minutes left. Let me, just on the treaty, the question was whether this could truly protect human rights. The answer to that question, whether a treaty could truly protect human rights, the answer to that question would depend on what the definition of cybersecurity would be, what the specific provisions of the cybersecurity treaty would look like. So it's not different from other areas of international affairs and other security policies. The good news is that we obviously have this resolution from the UN Human Rights Council already, which affirms that human rights apply online as well as offline, and therefore states have an obligation to protect human rights applying online as well as offline. So for the last 6 minutes, the next question is, what is the best forum for civil society to advocate for a human rights approach to cybersecurity? Which avenue is most effective? That's a great question. I don't think there is a single best forum that civil society should be focusing on, because as you all know, cybersecurity is so broad that it's being discussed both at the national and international level, in regional organizations and international organizations. So I think it's important to be present in many of them, and to be more present in some of them where civil society currently hasn't been engaged in. I think there's been a lot of focus on the privacy debate, a lot of focus on cybercrime. I think there's been less focus on some of the discussions from an international peace and security perspective. And so I think there are pieces of this broader ecosystem where civil society hasn't been that engaged in, where it can become more engaged in the future. And the best forum for your organization to become involved in, I think, depends on where you are geographically located and what regional organizations your NGO is already part of. And then to look into what specific stream of the policy debate you want to focus on. Are you more interested in the cybercrime discussion or any of the others? And to then read more specific reports on any of those streams. So, for example, another report that ICT for Peace published is called a baseline report that provides a mapping and general overview of the different organizations and processes that have been discussing cybersecurity over the last 5 years, both from the various perspectives. So I encourage you to read that report to identify which organizations have been discussing cybersecurity, which have been making progress over the last 3 to 5 years, what is currently on their agenda in the next 2 to 3 years, and then find out to what degree your organization can be involved in those discussions to have an impact. So the last question, I believe, is relates to the UN Security Council, and the question is, does the UN Security Council have any say in cybersecurity? If so, how much? In short, the UN Security Council obviously has a say in cybersecurity if it wants to have a say in cybersecurity. Based on the UN Charter, the UN Security Council is the organ within the UN system that has the power to create binding resolutions. So only the UN Security Council resolutions are binding on all UN member states. The General Assembly resolutions are not legally binding. So the UN Security Council can seize any matter relating to international peace and security, which could include cybersecurity. The question is whether the UN Security Council member states want to make cybersecurity a topic of discussion. And so far, the UN Security Council has not made this a focus of its activities. There has been a presidential statement relating to cybersecurity, but other than that, there have been external people who have been making the case that the UN Security Council should be involved and should become involved. But to date, the UN Security Council has had a very limited role in this, and the UN member states have primarily focused on the UN General Assembly's first committee that focuses on international peace and security as part of the General Assembly structure, and the group of governmental experts that is part of that process. Again, if you're more interested in this piece and the UN piece, I encourage you to read the ICT for Peace report that outlines the UN system and the processes in greater detail. Or if you have a specific question, feel free to email me as well. I'm happy to answer those. Some last-minute, very specific questions in the last 2 minutes. First, how can women's rights groups frame the cybersecurity debates? Do you know of any particular groups working on this? That's a great question. I think there is a group active on this topic to a certain extent in New York. I don't remember the exact name, so whoever asked that question, please send me an email after the webinar, and I'm happy to look into this and to provide you with the name. And how can women's rights groups frame the cybersecurity debate? I think depends on what the women's rights groups' goal is in what they are hoping to achieve by becoming involved in the cybersecurity debate, and what impact you would like to have. If you would like to highlight the specific risks and threats that women groups might face from relating to cybersecurity, or whether it's more the value that the internet brings to women's groups. So I think it really depends on how you're approaching this topic and what you're trying to highlight as part of that debate. And then the last question is, are there any benefits of having weak cybersecurity standards? Let me reread this. Are there any benefits of having weak cybersecurity standards? From a cybersecurity perspective, no. I think that's a pretty straightforward answer. My email address was just sent through the chat, so please feel free to follow up with an email if you have any further questions. As I said, this was meant to be just a general outline and rough outline of cybersecurity and the human rights dimension and the webinar series. You will get a lot more information in detail about specific pieces of this over the next 6 weeks. So I hope you enjoyed this first session and will join us for the subsequent sessions. You will find more information about how civil society can become engaged in cybersecurity discussions, a mapping of cybersecurity discussions, the relationship between human rights and international humanitarian law, and how to think about this from a technical approach on the website. We will post those in the next few days. And the next webinar will focus on the technology behind the policy debate, presented by Niels ten Over, and you will receive a link to that. Last but not least, let me thank Aditi Gupta and Natalie Green, who my colleagues who've been helping me with this and who've been moderating the Q&A. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to hopefully meeting many of you in The Hague. And please do reach out if you have any questions or any comments after this webinar. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.